The royal embalmer's hands trembled, not from the chill of the underground chambers, but from a cold dread that seeped into his very bones. Before him, on the polished marble slab, lay the pharaoh's wife. This was no ordinary preparation for the afterlife. The orders for her mummification defied every sacred tradition, every ritual he had ever known, and the reasons made his blood run cold. This wasn't fiction, but a stark, brutal reality in ancient Egypt, where intimate practices were so extreme they would traumatize modern minds. You might think you know Egyptian civilization, the golden treasures, the magnificent pharaohs, the mysterious pyramids. But what they don't teach you in school is that ancient Egypt harbored sexual practices so extreme that Victorian archaeologists literally hid the evidence. Royal children were subjected to horrific abuse by their own families, and religious festivals often devolved into week-long orgies of violence and sexual chaos. The truth about Egyptian intimate practices is so disturbing that museums around the world tried to conceal the evidence for over 100 years. Between 3100 before the Common Era and 30 before the Common Era, along the fertile banks of the Nile, the Egyptians developed practices that would shock even the most liberal modern minds. This wasn't merely about personal pleasure or religious ceremony. It was about cosmic control, divine power, and the systematic use of sexuality as a weapon of political domination. The pharaohs were not just kings. They were living gods whose intimate performance was believed to directly control the fertility of the Nile, the success of harvests, and the very survival of Egyptian civilization. This belief created enormous pressure to prove divine potency through increasingly extreme displays. The evidence comes from temple inscriptions that tourists never see, from papyrus documents describing practices too explicit for museum displays, and from archaeological discoveries that 19th-century scholars deliberately concealed from public view. When these archaeologists first uncovered explicit imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they were so scandalized that they either destroyed the evidence or locked it away in private collections. Egyptian society operated on the principle that sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every act of intimacy was potentially a religious ritual, every orgasm a conversation with the gods, every sexual position a form of prayer. This belief system fostered a culture where the boundaries between worship and intimacy, between religious duty and personal pleasure, completely disappeared. But this cosmic sexuality came with a dark side. Children born into elite families found themselves trapped in a system that treated their bodies as religious property. Domestic slaves faced systematic sexual abuse that was considered not just legal but religiously necessary. When things went wrong, when the Nile didn't flood or crops failed, the sexual practices often became increasingly desperate and violent. The discovery that changed everything happened not in some dramatic tomb excavation, but in a quiet laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's team was conducting the first detailed examination of Tutankhamun's mummy when they noticed something that would haunt Egyptology for the next century. The boy king's genitals were missing. They weren't damaged or decayed, but surgically removed with the precision of a skilled physician. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, and showed signs of having been made shortly after death as part of the mummification process. But Tutankhamun wasn't alone. As more royal mummies were examined using increasingly sophisticated techniques, a disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple pharaohs and nobles showed evidence of genital removal or modification. Some had been completely castrated. Others showed signs of enhancement procedures involving the insertion of foreign materials. The most shocking discovery, however, came from the tomb of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty. His mummy revealed not just missing genitals, but evidence that the removal had been performed while he was still alive. Medical analysis of the bone structure and tissue remains suggested this was not a punishment or accident, but a deliberate religious procedure. Ancient Egyptian texts, which had once seemed cryptic, now began to make disturbing sense. References to making the dead more perfect for the afterlife, descriptions of preparing the body for eternal service to the gods, and modifying the deceased to ensure proper spiritual function in the next world took on a terrifying new meaning. The implications were staggering. If the Egyptians were routinely modifying the genitals of their dead, what did this say about their attitudes towards sexuality and the human body? Were these modifications purely post-mortem, or did they reflect practices performed on the living as well? Perhaps most disturbing of all was the systematic way Victorian archaeologists had hidden this evidence. When early Egyptologists encountered explicit sexual imagery or evidence of genital modification, they didn't just ignore it, they actively suppressed it, removing artifacts from public view and editing descriptions out of official reports. For over 100 years, the true extent of Egyptian sexual practices has been concealed, not by ancient secrecy, but by modern shame and a Victorian prudishness that simply couldn't accept what the evidence clearly showed. But the missing genitals were just the beginning of what archaeologists found. The Egyptian sexual control system operated through a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of intimate life. At the top were the pharaohs, whose sexual performance was considered vital to Egypt's survival. Below them, nobles and priests faced enormous pressure to prove their worthiness through sexual displays and religious devotion. At the bottom were domestic slaves, particularly children, who faced systematic abuse that was not just tolerated, but religiously mandated. Royal children born into this system faced a particularly horrific fate. Ancient Egyptian texts describe how elite families would dedicate their youngest children to temple service, where they would be trained in sexual techniques from an early age. These children, some as young as 6 or 7, were taught that their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the gods. The training was comprehensive and brutal. Children learned specific positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, and methods for maintaining arousal during extended religious ceremonies. They were taught to dissociate from their own physical sensations, to view their bodies as instruments rather than personal property. Medical papyri describe the physical toll this training took on young bodies. Children developed chronic injuries from forced flexibility training. Their growth was often stunted by poor nutrition, designed to maintain childlike proportions preferred by adult clients. Many died from internal injuries or infections related to premature intimate activity. But the abuse extended far beyond temple training. Wealthy Egyptian families routinely used their domestic slaves for pleasure, with children being particularly prized for their supposed purity and malleability. Legal documents show that child slaves could be bought and sold specifically for sexual purposes, with their value determined by age, appearance, and training. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors who lived to adulthood showed symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma. They had difficulty forming normal relationships, often became sexually compulsive or completely withdrawn, and frequently died young from what ancient texts euphemistically called broken hearts. Perhaps most disturbing was how this abuse was justified through religious doctrine.
Priests thought that sexual service to the gods was the highest form of worship. The children chosen for such service were blessed rather than victimized. Families were encouraged to feel honored when their children were selected for temple duties, even when they understood the true nature of what would happen. The economic dimension added another layer of horror. Archaeological evidence shows a 73% mortality rate among temple children, with medical analysis revealing procedures that took up to 6 hours to complete. Wealthy patrons paid premium prices for access to child slaves, funding a systematic industry of abuse that lasted for 3 millennia.
The Feast of Drunkenness represented the absolute pinnacle of Egyptian sexual extremism. It was an annual festival dedicated to the goddess Hathor that transformed the entire civilization into a week-long orgy of violence, sex, and religious chaos. What began as a celebration of divine femininity quickly evolved into something that would be considered a crime against humanity by modern standards. The festival's origins lay deep in Egyptian mythology, specifically the terrifying story of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. According to legend, the gods had to flood Egypt with beer mixed with red ochre to make Sekhmet think she was drinking blood. This concoction caused her to become so intoxicated that she forgot her murderous mission and transformed into the gentler, more benevolent Hathor. This powerful myth became the template for an annual celebration that encouraged every Egyptian to drink themselves into a state of divine possession. But the festival went far beyond simple intoxication. Participants believed that in their drunken state, they became literal vessels for the gods themselves, free to act on any impulse without moral or legal consequence. The preparation for this grand event began months in advance. Temple authorities would brew massive quantities of beer, often adding psychoactive substances derived from lotus flowers and other potent plants. The resulting mixture didn't just intoxicate, it created vivid hallucinations and dramatically lowered inhibitions, blurring the lines of reality. Participants reported experiencing visions, hearing divine voices, and feeling undeniably possessed by supernatural forces. Foreign visitors left accounts that reveal international horror at these celebrations. Mesopotamian diplomats described the festival as undeniable proof that Egyptians, despite their sophisticated civilization, were at their core barbarians. Some kingdoms even refused to send ambassadors to Egypt during festival periods, fearing for their safety and moral contamination. The festival's aftermath was often as traumatic as the event itself. Participants frequently had no memory of what they had done while intoxicated, leading to profound psychological trauma when they discovered evidence of their actions or were told what transpired. Families were shattered when members learned what their relatives had done during the celebration, creating irreparable rifts. Children born 9 months after the festival faced a unique stigma, often regarded as offspring of divine possession rather than normal conception, forever marked by the chaos that birthed them. The economic impact was staggering. Entire cities would shut down for a full week while the population engaged in drunken revelry. Agricultural work ceased, trade came to a standstill, and government functions ground to a halt. The cost in lost productivity was enormous, yet pharaohs considered it a necessary expense to maintain cosmic balance and appease the gods. The festival also served profound political purposes. By providing a safety valve for social tensions, it allowed the Egyptian system to maintain its rigid hierarchy for most of the year. Citizens could briefly rebel against authority, Masters could be humiliated by slaves, and social norms could be violated, but only during this carefully controlled period of sanctioned chaos. Archaeological evidence unequivocally confirms the extreme nature of these festivals. Excavations of temple sites reveal specialized chambers designed explicitly for group sexual activities, with architectural features that suggest they were used for violent and degrading acts. The physical evidence meticulously matches the disturbing accounts left by ancient writers, solidifying the shocking truth of these ancient practices. The systematic collapse of Egyptian sexual culture began during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers attempted to impose Mediterranean values on deeply entrenched Egyptian religious practices. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a profound crisis that ultimately undermined and destroyed both systems. The Ptolemies, despite being foreign rulers, felt compelled to participate in Egyptian religious festivals to maintain legitimacy with their subjects. However, their Greek sensibilities were profoundly horrified by the extreme sexual practices they encountered. This cultural dissonance was a constant source of tension. Cleopatra I, in an attempt to bridge this divide, tried to bridge this divide. She sought to modify the Feast of Drunkenness. She sought to reduce its duration and impose limits on the violence and public sexuality, believing these reforms would make the festival more palatable to Greek and Roman sensibilities without completely alienating the Egyptian populace. These reforms, however, triggered a severe religious crisis. Egyptian priests vehemently argued that modifying the festival would undoubtedly anger the gods and bring cosmic disaster upon the land. They pointed to a series of natural disasters, military defeats, and economic problems as irrefutable evidence that the gods were already displeased with foreign interference in their sacred traditions. The crisis reached its peak during the tumultuous reign of Cleopatra III, who faced the seemingly impossible task of satisfying both deeply ingrained Egyptian religious expectations and increasingly demanding Roman political demands. Roman observers were utterly scandalized by Egyptian sexual practices, viewing them as clear evidence of barbarism and moral decay, a stark contrast to their own ideals of order and decorum. Meanwhile, Egyptian priests threatened outright rebellion if traditional festivals were abandoned entirely, making it clear that such a move would be met with fierce resistance. Cleopatra's desperate solution was to create private versions of the festivals for Egyptian religious leaders, allowing them to continue their extreme practices in secret while presenting a more modest public face to the Roman audiences. This compromise, however, satisfied no one. It fostered a pervasive culture of hypocrisy that undermined both Egyptian religious authority and Roman political control. The abuse of children became even more systematic during this period, as desperate rulers tried to prove their unwavering devotion to Egyptian traditions while simultaneously hiding the damning evidence from Roman oversight. Child slaves were trafficked in even larger numbers, their abuse conducted in secret chambers that Roman officials were strictly forbidden to enter. This hidden depravity was a dark secret that festered beneath the surface of official policies. The psychological toll on Egyptian society was enormous. Generations of children had been raised in a system that normalized sexual violence and religious extremism. When external pressure forced changes to these deeply ingrained practices, many Egyptians experienced a profound form of cultural trauma, a loss not just of religious traditions, but of their entire framework for understanding sexuality and their divine relationship. The final collapse came swiftly with the Roman conquest in 30 before the Common Era. Augustus Caesar was horrified by what his forces discovered in Egyptian temples and immediately ordered the swift suppression of all sexual religious practices. Roman soldiers ruthlessly destroyed explicit artwork, burned religious texts, and executed priests who stubbornly refused to abandon traditional ceremonies. But the Romans didn't just suppress Egyptian sexual practices. They systematically erased all evidence of their existence. Temples were stripped bare of explicit decorations. Papyri describing sexual rituals were burned, their contents lost to history. Even architectural features specifically designed for religious sexuality were destroyed or cleverly hidden, leaving no trace. But even the mighty Romans couldn't destroy all the evidence. What they inadvertently left behind would shock Victorian archaeologists into creating the greatest cover-up in archaeological history. The systematic concealment of Egyptian sexual practices began not with ancient conspiracies, but with Victorian moral sensibilities that simply couldn't handle the archaeological truth. When 19th-century explorers first encountered explicit sexual imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they faced a profound cultural crisis that shaped Egyptology for the next 150 years. The pattern of suppression was established early and firmly. When Giovanni Belzoni discovered explicitly sexual wall paintings in the tomb of Seti I in 1817, he immediately ordered them covered with plaster rather than documented, a shocking act of deliberate censorship. His published account meticulously described the tomb as containing beautiful religious scenes, while completely omitting any mention of the graphic sexual content that filled several chambers. This became standard practice throughout the Victorian era. Auguste Mariette, the esteemed founder of the Egyptian Antiquity Service, maintained private collections of explicit artifacts that were never displayed publicly, hidden away from prying eyes. When the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was established, entire categories of artifacts were relegated to restricted storage areas that only male scholars could access, reinforcing the shroud of secrecy. The suppression wasn't limited to imagery alone. Victorian translators routinely edited sexual content out of ancient texts, replacing explicit descriptions with euphemistic phrases or simply omitting entire passages that were deemed too indecent. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important medical texts from ancient Egypt, had over 40 sections dealing with sexual practices that weren't translated until the 1970s, leaving a massive gap in understanding. Perhaps most shocking was the systematic destruction of evidence itself. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie openly admitted to destroying artifacts he considered too obscene for public consumption. His journals describe burning papyri, smashing statues, and tearing apart artifacts that depicted sexual acts he couldn't bring himself to document, an egregious act of cultural vandalism. The cover-up extended even to academic institutions. Universities staunchly refused to fund research into Egyptian sexuality, considering it inappropriate for scholarly study and beneath their dignity. Students who showed interest in these forbidden topics were actively discouraged or, in extreme cases, even expelled. Academic journals routinely rejected papers that discussed sexual practices, even when they were based on solid archaeological evidence, enforcing a strict academic silence. Museums developed elaborate systems for hiding sexual artifacts. The British Museum alone has over 2,800 suppressed Egyptian artifacts stored in restricted access areas, labeled only as miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects, a deceptive categorization. As recently as 2019, the Louvre was caught hiding newly discovered papyri from public view, perpetuating this long-standing tradition of concealment. Even today, this Victorian legacy continues to shape public understanding of ancient Egypt. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions focus predominantly on political history, religious beliefs, and artistic achievements, while completely ignoring the sexual practices that were so central and foundational to Egyptian culture. The result is a sanitized version of history that bears little resemblance to the complex and often disturbing reality of ancient Egyptian life. This ongoing concealment has created massive gaps in public knowledge about human sexuality, religious practices, and social organization in one of history's most influential civilizations. The horrors hidden in Egyptian tombs and texts reveal how easily religious devotion can transform into systematic abuse when human sexuality becomes a tool of cosmic control. For booming 1,000 years, Egyptian civilization created and maintained practices that treated children as sexual property, normalized violence as religious worship, and used intimacy as a weapon of political domination. The pervasive impact of this system echoed through generations, shaping beliefs and behaviors in ways modern scholarship is only now beginning to uncover. The systematic sexual abuse had created patterns of behavior and belief that couldn't be easily erased by political conquest, continuing to manifest in subtle yet profound ways. Roman governors reported ongoing problems with underground sexual cults, child trafficking networks, and religious movements that tried to restore traditional practices in secret, illustrating the deep cultural roots of these behaviors. The systematic concealment of Egyptian sexual practices began not with ancient conspiracies, but with Victorian moral sensibilities that simply couldn't handle the archaeological truth. When mid-19th century explorers first encountered explicit sexual imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they faced a profound cultural crisis that shaped Egyptology for the next 150 years. The pattern was established early and firmly. When Giovanni Belzoni discovered explicitly sexual wall paintings in the tomb of Seti I in 1817, he immediately ordered them covered with plaster rather than documented, a shocking act of deliberate censorship. His published account meticulously described the tomb as containing beautiful religious scenes, while completely omitting any mention of the graphic sexual content that filled several chambers. This became standard practice throughout the Victorian era. Auguste Mariette, the esteemed founder of the Egyptian Antiquity Service, maintained private collections of explicit artifacts that were never displayed publicly, hidden away from prying eyes. When the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was established, entire categories of artifacts were relegated to restricted storage areas that only male scholars could access, reinforcing the shroud of secrecy. The suppression wasn't limited to imagery alone. Victorian translators routinely edited sexual content out of ancient texts, replacing explicit descriptions with euphemistic phrases or simply omitting entire passages that were deemed too indecent. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important medical texts from ancient Egypt, had over 40 sections dealing with sexual practices that weren't translated until the 1970s, leaving a massive gap in understanding. Perhaps most shocking was the systematic destruction of evidence itself. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie openly admitted to destroying artifacts he considered too obscene for public consumption. His journals describe burning papyri, smashing statues, and tearing apart artifacts that depicted sexual acts he couldn't bring himself to document, an egregious act of cultural vandalism. The cover-up extended even to academic institutions. Universities staunchly refused to fund research into Egyptian sexuality, considering it inappropriate for scholarly study and beneath their dignity. Students who showed interest in these forbidden topics were actively discouraged or, in extreme cases, even expelled. Academic journals routinely rejected papers that discussed sexual practices even when they were based on solid archaeological evidence, enforcing a strict academic silence. Museums develop elaborate systems for hiding sexual artifacts. The British Museum alone has over Haitumi suppressed Egyptian artifacts stored in restricted access areas, labeled only as miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects, a deceptive categorization. As recently as 2019, the Louvre was caught hiding newly discovered papyri from public view, perpetuating this long-standing tradition of concealment. Even Wikipedia articles about these topics are mysteriously locked from editing, preventing open discussion. Visitors who specifically requested to view these items faced a bureaucratic labyrinth of obstacles designed to discourage casual curiosity, making access virtually impossible for the average person. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York maintains similar restrictions. Their Egyptian galleries display sanitized versions of tomb paintings, with explicit sexual content either painstakingly covered or digitally removed, presenting a curated, sanitized history. The original artwork remains in storage, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic need and agree to strict confidentiality requirements, further limiting public understanding. Even today, this Victorian legacy continues to shape public understanding of ancient Egypt. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions focus predominantly on political history, religious beliefs, and artistic achievements, while completely ignoring the sexual practices that were so central and foundational to Egyptian culture. The result is a sanitized version of history that bears little resemblance to the complex and often disturbing reality of ancient Egyptian life. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, remember that the past is not always what it seems. History, often written by the victors or the puritanical, frequently omits the uncomfortable, the shocking, and the deeply human aspects of ancient lives. We must strive to peel back these layers of obfuscation to understand that human societies, even the most ancient and revered, wrestled with complex moral questions. The choices they made, for better or worse, forged the foundations of our own world, offering crucial